Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. We are here at this event that we're calling Practical Wisdom in a Time of COVID and Beyond. My name is Andy Smerick, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Manhattan Institute. I'm going to moderate the discussion today, and in just a moment, I'm going to hand it off to our three outstanding panelists who are going to really take it from there. But first, I want to just do a little bit of throat clearing on just a brief explanation of this subject and why I think it's so important right now. Obviously, America is facing major challenges right now. We're grappling with a once-in-a-century pandemic. We have millions of people out of work. Thousands of schools are still shuttered. We have civil unrest in numbers of cities. And obviously, all of these issues are intertwined, but it's also the case that we had big problems prior to COVID as well. Huge budget deficits, the opioid addiction crisis, abnormally low labor participation rates, deaths of despair. I could go on. So we've had challenges. They're just more pronounced now, perhaps. So the question for us is, how do we go about solving these problems? And one model is, as the saying goes, to just follow the science. Essentially, just treat these problems as technical matters that can be resolved by impartial, highly educated experts. The problem, of course, is that experts are humans, just like the rest of us. They make mistakes, sometimes big mistakes. They can also be biased, just like we can. And also, in a big, diverse continental republic like ours, there are legitimate differences of opinion about among the people about governing principles and governing philosophies and priorities. And we have to admit that America, we have an independent, free-thinking, sometimes stubborn population that doesn't want to delegate its decision-making to folks that they don't know and who may not share their same values. So we could go in the total opposite direction and empower people without subject matter expertise and without experience in governing, and then trust that they are going to use their everyday common sense to solve our problems. And this certainly appeals to our notions of equality and democracy. The problem, again, though, is what happens if these people just don't know very much about the way government functions internally? What happens if they don't know very much about what laws, regulations, court cases, or public programs are applicable in certain situations? Or what happens if they just aren't skilled at balancing and accommodating different views among America's diverse citizenry? So we can find ourselves in a bind. Now, there's this great story that offers us an alternative to these two models, the brilliant technical expert model and the governing novice model. A guy named Sam Rayburn was the old grizzled Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives when John Kennedy was elected president back in 1960. And Kennedy started hiring people for his administration who'd later be known as the whiz kids or the best and the brightest. And they were young often, but they were super smart and super well educated, idealistic, energetic, and they came from industry and academia. The vice president at the time, LBJ, tried to convince old grizzled Sam Rayburn how amazing these whiz kids were. And Rayburn replied, "Well, Lyndon, you may be right and they may be every bit as intelligent as you say they are, but I'd feel a whole lot better about them if just one of them had run for sheriff once." The point he was trying to make and that we're getting at here is maybe you learn invaluable lessons from hands-on experience, things you can't learn from a textbook, things you can't learn just by going on gut. So in terms of governing, what this would mean is that there is something important about a track record of public leadership. So thankfully, we have this ancient concept going back hundreds, thousands of years called practical wisdom. It relates to how doing shapes the doer, teaching the doer what questions to ask, how to respond, what to expect, and much more. It also suggests in interesting ways that the person who is seasoned in doing a thing will differ from the types of people who are studying the thing or talking about the thing. Now, obviously, this could apply to plumbing or engineering or farming or lots of other fields, but it has applications for governing, and I think it has big applications for governing during times of crisis when we really need great government. So all of this leads to the big question that we're grappling with here today, which is there such thing that we should consider as practical wisdom in statecraft? Okay, so on to our three amazing panelists. The way we're going to proceed, I'm going to introduce them and each will get about 5 minutes to share their opening thoughts. We'll get the conversation going then. I like to get audience questions in early, so if you want to use the chat function to submit a question, please do. I will get that into the bloodstream. I'll give all the panelists a couple minutes to close at the end, and then we'll be out of here by 11 a.m. Okay, so let me introduce these great panelists. First up is Jennifer Frey. She is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina and a fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology at Catholic University. She's written widely on virtue ethics, happiness, moral psychology. She recently edited a book titled Self-Transcendence and Virtue, and she's currently editing a volume for Oxford University Press titled Practical Wisdom. And I should also say that she is the host of this great podcast called Sacred and Profane Love, to which I subscribe, and you should too. She lives in Columbia, South Carolina with her husband and their 6 kids. Next up will be Tony Mills. He is a senior fellow and director of science policy at the R Street Institute. He's a senior fellow also at the Pepperdine School of Public Policy and an associate at the Society of Catholic Scientists. He researches and writes on everything from science and technology and philosophy and religion, and also the way that expertise plays in a democracy. And then last but certainly not least is Jocelyn Pickford. She's an education policy and communication specialist for HCM Strategies. She has experience in just about every single corner of American public education. She's a product of public schools and a former classroom teacher. She was a senior leader at the U.S. Department of Education and helped lead initiatives for state departments of ed and local school districts, and working with nonprofits in education like the George W. Bush Institute, the Gates Foundation, the College Board, and more. She lives outside of Philadelphia, and she's currently a proud public school parent and a member of her local school board, which is dealing with all of these COVID-related issues. Okay, so let's get started. Professor Frey, if you don't mind, could you tell us what in the world is practical wisdom, and what does it tell us about expertise and experience?
Yes, I would love to talk about practical wisdom. Thanks, Andy, for inviting me. So unfortunately, practical wisdom is very marginalized in our public discourse, but it's also marginalized within the academy and within philosophy. However, if you go back to the very beginning of philosophy, so the ancient Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle, you will find that practical wisdom is at the heart of their thought. Especially their ethical and their political philosophy. And for them, ethics and politics are really part of the same practical science. And for Plato and Aristotle, ethics is about what it means to live well or to flourish as human beings. And both Plato and Aristotle recognize that human beings aren't first and foremost isolated, autonomous individuals who have to decide whether or not they want to deal with other people, but they're essentially social, rational, political animals. So they have to, if we think about human flourishing, then we're thinking about society, we're thinking about the polis or the city-state, and what are the conditions in which we can flourish together. And when they think about ethics and politics, they're thinking about the highest good. They're thinking about what is it that constitutes human flourishing, objectively speaking. And in the final analysis, they think, well, look, that's the goal. That's what we want, whatever it is. And they also both insist that in order to attain human flourishing, whatever that turns out to be, you're going to have virtues. And virtues, the Greek word for virtue is arete, which literally means excellence. And they mean excellences of the soul. So these are habits or stable dispositions of thought, action, and feeling that contribute or constitute a flourishing society. And we just need to develop these habits or stable dispositions. And again, they're of thought, action, and feeling. So it's really a cultivation of the whole person. And you need this in order to live well. And really the master virtue for both Plato and Aristotle is practical wisdom. In the Greek, it's phronesis. In the Latin traditions, it's prudencia, right? And it's just the idea that living well takes a certain specific kind of practical intelligence. So there's theoretical intelligence. Maybe you have a deep understanding of the cosmos. And of course, they think that's valuable and important. But they also recognize you could have that and nobody would want you to be in charge of society, right? In fact, famously, you could be a wonderful theoretical physicist or a mathematician and barely be able to tie your shoes. So there's a kind of theoretical wisdom And practical wisdom is practical. That is to say, it's aimed at realizing the good. So not just knowing the good, but realizing the good in your actions, so that you can bring about whatever it is a flourishing society amounts to. And again, it's a specific kind of intelligence. It's practical. But within the space of practical intelligence, practical wisdom is still a unique kind. So there's a kind of intelligence that is what they call technical or techne, I think what we would call expertise on the one hand. And then there's sort of like mere cleverness on the other. And practical wisdom is something else. So let's start with techne or expertise. This is a specific kind of practical intelligence. But it's very narrow. So it's relative to a specific goal or bringing about a specific product, right? So practical kinds of intelligence might be like, I don't know, being an excellent basketball player or being a grammarian or being a good writer. And to have this kind of practical intelligence, it takes habits and experience. So it's not a kind of a priori knowledge. Young people typically aren't experts. It takes a lot of experience. And it often involves a kind of master-apprentice relationship. So there has to be some kind of exemplar that you can look to and imitate in order to have this specific kind of intelligence. And when Aristotle in particular talks about practical wisdom, he notes, and this is very important, that practical wisdom has all the features of experience, but it cannot be reduced. Sorry, it has all the features of expertise, but it cannot be reduced to expertise. Why not? And the reason is, really, there are two reasons. One is that expertise is always relative to a very narrow domain, and practical wisdom is about human flourishing in general. So that's an important difference. But an even more deeper difference for Aristotle is that you can actually use your expertise to bring about a bad end. So you can expertly, as a grammarian, write an ungrammatical sentence. And in fact, as a grammarian in teaching grammar, you will do that and you will do it well. It will be an instance of an exercise of your expertise. You cannot do that with practical wisdom. Okay, you cannot use your practical wisdom to bring about something that's not human flourishing. What explains this difference? For Aristotle, it's because the kind of habits that you need in order to have good practical judgment, that is the kind of judgment of practical wisdom, you have to have moral virtue. So he thinks that in order to be wise about what constitutes human flourishing for the city, you actually have to have what he calls correct desire. So you have to have moral virtue. And so leadership, real political leadership, involves virtue. And so actually the moral character of the leader is incredibly important. And it should be obvious that this is sort of lost on us now. We sort of adapt a more Machiavellian model, or what Aristotle calls mere cleverness. So the merely clever man has a specific kind of practical intelligence, namely, if you give him an end, if you say, make this happen, he can find the means. And that's a definite form of intelligence. And Aristotle doesn't deny that, but it will not bring about human flourishing, right? It'll bring about whatever end it is that you want. And so I think we've lost this concept of practical wisdom, but I think especially now, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in our broader discussion, it seems to me that it's more important than ever that we be able to separate out mere cleverness from expertise and actual political prudence.
That's great. One thing I'm going to want to come back to later on is a question I always get from people is, well, but experience in a certain domain doesn't necessarily lead people to be more moral. You can actually find lots of highly experienced, immoral people. So what do we make of that? So let's just put that in the parking lot for the time being. Tony, you've been writing a ton about judgment and the role of expertise in democracies. So what do you make of all this stuff?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just say thanks, Andy, and also thanks to the Manhattan Institute for convening this and for inviting me. What I would do, so I want to shift the focus a little bit and think about the notion of scientific expertise, and specifically what we take it to be. By we, I mean thinking of as non-scientific experts, whether we're policymakers or whatever, and what we sort of expect of or ask of scientific expertise. And I think the way you put it, Andy, is the way I would begin, which is thinking about judgment. So when we're making a practical decision in a political situation, that requires it depends in some way, say on some kind of scientific knowledge. What we're doing is, or what we should be doing, is relying on expert judgment. And so I think the fact that the judgment in question is expert judgment is quite significant. It sounds sort of tautological to emphasize that, but I think there's a lot packed into that. So I think generally, often, we don't think about scientific knowledge this way. We think about it more like a product. We think about science as a kind of black box, or maybe a vending machine. We put in our money, we pick what we want, we press the button, and then out pops some scientific knowledge, which we can then use or not as we see fit. And I think that this kind of, it sounds sort of, I'm deliberately painting a cartoonish picture, but I think that this way of thinking is actually quite pervasive in our public discourse. And I think the reason is that it's in part psychologically comforting, maybe politically convenient, because it allows us to think that once we have the scientific knowledge or evidence, then we can really restrict the role of judgment and deliberation. And so that any effort to interpose judgment or deliberation can be dismissed as not just wrong, but non-scientific. But what I would suggest is that this is not just a bad view of political decision-making, it's a bad view of scientific expertise. And I would propose thinking about scientific expertise more along the lines of a craft, a particular kind of craft. If we're talking about theoretical sciences, we have we're not interested in producing something, we're interested in knowing something. But yet the analogy with craft, I think, is quite helpful, because scientific experts are people that have cultivated the particular skills, habits, instincts in a given domain. And this requires, this gets to some of the issues that Professor Frey was talking about, requires intellectual virtues, and indeed some kinds of moral virtues as well. Scientists, if you're flagrantly dishonest, you won't be able to judge empirical data fairly or to report your findings fairly. But there are kinds of intellectual virtues specific to your craft. And so when we ask scientific experts for their judgment when making a political decision that needs to be informed by their knowledge, we're asking them to apply their judgment, to bring their skills and knowledge to bear, typically on a new situation, a situation where there's considerable uncertainty. And so when this, I think, makes pretty clear that the scientific expertise can be wrong, right? Human judgment is not infallible. And this is a stronger claim than the normal sort of empirical fallibility we might normally or should associate with scientific knowledge. If we're asking for an expert to make a judgment about something, especially in a situation with considerable uncertainty, there's, of course, a reasonable chance that that judgment is not right. It's also possible that there's disagreement among experts. And so I think that emphasizing this role of judgment is significant, because it allows us to see that relying on scientific knowledge isn't about consuming a product ready-made that arrives into the political scene, but it's about deliberating with experts. And this cuts both ways. If we recognize that expert judgment is fallible, that experts can disagree, then when there is uncertainty or disagreement, that's not reason to radically distrust all experts, right? So if an expert changes the judgment that he or she is making in light of new evidence or in light of a new circumstance, that it could show bias or just simple bad judgment, but it could also be very good judgment on the part of an expert. And so we have to be willing to allow for a certain amount of deference. Now, deference, of course, is not absolute. So the analogy that I sometimes use is, if you have to go to a car mechanic, it could be because your car breaks down or something. It could be that you have the expertise to fix your own car, but most of us probably don't. And so you go to the car mechanic because you rely on that person's skill. They have something that you don't have. So in some sense, you have to be deferential to that form of expertise, but of course not absolutely deferential. First of all, you have to be discriminating, right? You choose, if you can, what kind of car mechanic to go to. You can evaluate whether you think they're trustworthy. You have to exercise prudence. but you also have access to information that that expert doesn't have. Perhaps you're planning to sell your car. Perhaps you're planning to go on a long road trip. Those kinds of factors might determine what sort of decision you're going to make. In a political context where you're called upon, let's say you're a policymaker, to make a decision about a wide-ranging, multifaceted problem like a pandemic, lots of information obviously is going to be relevant, and lots of people, I think this is important, will be implicated by the judgment of the expert, the potential erroneous judgment of an expert. And this means that you're going to have to consult a much wider range of people, right? You may not have all the information, nor that particular expert. In other words, what I would sort of conclude this by saying is relying on scientific expertise is the kind of, requires a kind of deliberation. In deliberating well, part of deliberating well is knowing whom to deliberate with, whom to consult, and how to weigh their expert advice or non-expert advice, as the case may be. And so I think emphasizing this role of judgment is important because it shapes how we think about the interface between science and politics.
Okay, so that's great, and we're going to come back to just about all of that, but that's a perfect segue to Jocelyn. So to make this much more real, there are many reasons why I wanted to have Jocelyn as part of this panel, but one of them is this question, which is, you are sitting in a position right now on a governing board of a school system, and you are being hit by presumably lots of experts telling you things like, for example, if you bring kids back to school, blood will be on your hands because teachers and kids will die, but also other experts telling you that it's unconscionable not to bring them back. You have some scientific experts saying that everyone should socially distance until everything is solved. Other scientific experts said, well, social distance other than if you're doing a kind of protest with which we agree. And then you have parents saying one thing, and then you have local community members saying another. And so Tony's point about deliberation and using your judgment in the context of all of this expert opinion actually becomes like the stuff of real life decision making. So how have you grappled with these kinds of issues over the past, 6 months?
Yeah, thank you. And also thank you for having me. And it's a great conversation to be part of, giving me a lot to think about. I want to just pick up on 3 things that have been in the conversation so far, and then look forward to the discussion. First, this notion of, learning by doing something and doing it repeatedly, and how that applies to this decision-making place that I'm in right now. So I was actually a poetry major in college. And one of the most impactful things my poetry professor said to me was, you really have to know the world to make your poetry meaningful. And I would say the same thing goes with the consulting work that I do now, and certainly with governing, right? You can't advise or govern smartly on something that you haven't lived. And so certainly I'm in an experience now, having been a classroom teacher and working deeply in education policy, and kind of moving back and forth between the two, to understand that while both of those realms of experience, the sort of very practical being in the classroom, or now being a parent of 2 public school, elementary school children, gives me one kind of expertise, and being a policy advisor and having to understand data and those types of elements is also critical, but neither of those supersedes the other. And I think importantly, they inform each other, and sort of knowing which hat to wear in which moment of this decision-making on a school board has been a shifting and challenging proposition. It's one thing to interview teachers and parents and explore their feelings and perceptions on sort of a high level about what's happening. And it's another to be a parent watching a child struggle with remote learning, and to be a school board member hearing from people who have very different opinions on all sides of what we should be doing. So this notion of doing something repeatedly, gives us as much in a moment like this expertise and wisdom as we can try to draw from, and being able to flip-flop back and forth has been helpful to me. The second thing I wanted to pick up on, Andy, you actually wrote about in your recent piece in City Journal, which is, again, just how do we balance our roles between expertise and those who are governing, sort of the everyday American, which is definitely what I consider myself in a school board position. And so education, like all areas, but perhaps a little bit uniquely, we deal with both policy and politics, and we see it every day, and we see it at every level. So, again, it's one thing I know as an education expert of sorts. I understand education data. I know how to read an accountability dashboard. But it's another thing to know lived experience of my children and my neighbors' children, and what that data actually translates into the classroom, and what that means for all sorts of decisions for a school board, like curriculum choices and budgeting. So right now in this moment of COVID, I'm shifting daily between my role as a consultant and an expert who deals in data and expertise, and a role as a governing member of a board who has to make decisions. My district right now is currently remote only, and we are facing a decision of when and whether to return to a hybrid model. There are people with very strong feelings on both sides of that equation, as Andy pointed out. It gets very heated. And I will say, when it comes to this current pandemic, none of the expertise I have as an education policy specialist of sorts could have prepared me for some of the nuances of what is being faced at the local district level. So, we want to do we want to do hybrid learning. So that means half of the students are in a classroom learning with their teacher and the other half are at home. And wouldn't it be great if we could live stream their lessons so that both could have access to the teacher at the same time? Well, the practical reality of live streaming means you need microphones for the teachers and the students who have masks on. It's very hard to hear, right? Someone who's muffled in that environment. Most public school districts do not have microphones and broadcast studio type environments in their classrooms. We might have to double the teacher workforce in order to accommodate different cohorts. That's an extremely significant budget impact. Can't raise taxes right now in the middle of a recession. So these are very practical nuances that I wouldn't have considered if I was just wearing sort of an expert consultant hat. So here we are trying to use data, but data is subjective and it's ever changing. There are a lot of pieces that have come out that show that schools are not super spreaders. However, looking around my local area outside Philadelphia, we have districts that have opened and have had to close for a period of time. We have some that have stayed open and everything in between. So people can bring whatever story or piece of data that they find most impactful to the conversation and be valid in some ways. And so this brings me to the third point, and I really want to borrow from both Tony and Jennifer. Trust is variable and human flourishing is the goal. Well, I think we could agree no one is flourishing right now. And I think that's part of the challenge at this local school district level. We're angry, we're tired, we're frustrated. We want to flourish. That is the human instinct. And we can't do that in this limited environment where everything is changing. I joke that it's like we're juggling fireballs in quicksand with education decision making, where something new is coming at us every day and it's on fire. We did a district survey of how parents feel about remote learning, and we found much higher satisfaction with individual teachers than with distance learning overall. And this isn't surprising, right? Americans overall think our public schools are so-so, but if you ask how someone feels about your local public school, they feel pretty good about it. So trust, right, is observed most clearly, I think, at the most local level, in our homes, in individual student-teacher relationships. And so when we talk about sort of the fallibilities of scientific experts and how that compares to trust, I think this is being played out in our homes and classrooms right now. And it really impacts whether a family feels comfortable sending their child in. Do they trust the teacher? Do they trust the school? Do they trust the decision makers to be doing the right things for health and safety and for education? And so I would just close out this part by saying, Andy, again, in your piece, you referred to the Stockdale paradox. And I love that. How do you focus on the issue at hand? How do you be honest about your challenges, but also project confidence and a sense that we are going to get through this? And we are making the best decisions that we can. And I think school boards and superintendents and local district leaders are in this very challenging position of wanting to project that confidence while dealing with ever-changing conditions and a real, I think, dichotomy between this practical experience, practical wisdom, and the expertise that seems to be changing daily.
Oh, that's great. So a couple notes before I open up to all of you. One is an essay that I wrote, that Professor Frey wrote, and that Dr. Mills wrote should be available on the site where people are watching this right now. So if you're interested in any of these issues, you could read more. I want to give each of you the opportunity to respond to anything anyone else said. But one thing that really popped out to me, and you can respond to this or ignore it at your leisure, is the idea that at least 3 categories of potential skills dispositions were alluded to during the discussion so far. That is the kinds of stuff we would want leaders during these kinds of situations to have. One that Dr. Frey brought up is moral virtue, which is different than performance virtue and civic virtue and intellectual virtue, that there's something about honesty and integrity that we would probably want. Tony brought up this idea of judgment, that you probably need a certain set of skills for bringing together a bunch of different people's views and making a decision based on all of those things that is best given your conditions, the things that you're responsible for. And then Jocelyn brought up this amazing idea that I think is painful for a lot of us to deal with, which is in any particular domain, there are folks who just know a whole lot more about the ins and outs of what does it mean to get a bus ready for kids? What does it mean to have microphones ready for teachers? Or if you're a doctor, what does it mean to have the right kinds of protective equipment? The kinds of questions you wouldn't even know to ask if you don't know very much about that field. So thinking about like how do we generate leaders who are capable of those kinds of things is definitely on my mind. But Jen, do you want to go first? Do you have any general thoughts you want to respond to?
Yeah, well, so thank you. I mean, there was so much that everyone said that was so interesting, but I guess from my point of view, what really sticks out is the fact that, you know, it is all, I mean, practical wisdom is an ability to deliberate well, right? And when we think about good deliberation, good practical deliberation, we're always talking about very specific, concrete circumstances. And so one thing that I didn't mention, but I ought to have mentioned, is just that practical wisdom is not a set of like highly general rules that apply across all these cases. It's highly contextualized. And actually, Aristotle talks about it as having correct vision, right? And vision is always of particulars. It's about seeing what's practically salient, being able to pick out in your specific situation, like what needs to be done and how to respond. And I think that really tends to get lost because we tend to have this like highly centralized vision of how it has to work. And the truth is, you know, what's going to work for a school in rural America and what's going to work for a school in an urban environment are just different. And so if we try to have this policy that's going to apply in every case, we're going to fail people. And I think a lot of what has gone so terribly wrong in these COVID times is just that, you know, we haven't been fine-grained enough. We've completely ignored and marginalized certain communities, maybe because we decided they didn't matter, or also because, you know, I just think we're sort of stuck in this model of thinking that we have to come up with something highly general. And the truth is that's not how it works. And so I just wanted to highlight that.
Well, such a great point, because we have to recognize how many essays have we read from people saying we must open all schools or we must keep all schools closed. That probably gets a lot of ink and a lot of clicks, and that's not nearly as dramatic as saying, you know, let's be more nuanced about the 13,500 school districts and make particular decisions based on them. But it does raise a question of if you're the president of the United States and you can't make a decision for all 13,000 school districts, what does leadership look like at the highest level so you can create the conditions such that people can use local judgment in particular situations to make the best kinds of decisions possible? Tony, what do you think?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, again, kind of very much agreeing with the framework that the Professor Frey has outlined here. I would make a similar kind of argument about how we think about scientific expertise, that we have this view that, you know, there is this neutral body of scientific evidence out there, and we just have to, you know, grab onto what we need and apply it to the circumstance. But in fact, scientific knowledge is itself quite contextual. I mean, even our most robust kinds of scientific knowledge claims are claims about what happens under very specific circumstances. This is the way that scientific knowledge is able to be precise. So, you know, just a maybe example that is somewhat apropos, thinking about what kind of you use. If you're an epidemiologist, you have to model a disease a certain way. You have to make a judgment about what kind of model to use. It's not an arbitrary judgment, right? It's not just your gut. It's going to be informed by well-established theory and empirical evidence, statistical methods and heuristics and so on, but it's a judgment nonetheless. And it will depend on what you know or what you think you know or what you don't know about the given population that you're modeling, the behavior of the community in question. And so that's a very subtle kind of judgment that the expert's called upon to make, but it can have very significant consequences if it's an erroneous judgment, or if it's if the conditions under which the claims that it allows are forgotten. And so if we think about science as just this general thing, this sort of centralized idea that Professor Frey was mentioning. So typically, I think in scientific context, this doesn't really come up, right? It doesn't really matter, for the most part, what cosmologists say. Like, is the Big Bang true or is the steady state model true? That used to be a live debate. It might impact what you think about what you think you know about the cosmos, but it doesn't generally impact public policy or local decisions. Might impact, funding questions about basic science, maybe. And that there's a disagreement in the community that gets resolved a certain way. The expert community doesn't really have much impact, right? But it's when we are asking and need to ask scientific experts for their advice, their expert recommendation, that the fact of their use of judgment and the fact of disagreement become fraught. And those are the circumstances that we tend to find ourselves in when we're making practical decision making. So I think that's not a very comforting idea, because it doesn't allow us to sort of outsource our own decision making to scientific expertise, because we're recognizing that expertise is going to be fallible and to some extent context dependent.
That's great. Jocelyn, thoughts?
So, in education, right, there's a saying that everyone's an expert because everyone is educated. And so I think we face this, right? So we have parents who are the ultimate experts on their own children. We have teachers who are the experts on their classrooms and their instructional models. We have principals. We have all these layers in the system going all the way up to the state education agency and the federal agency, all of whom are now trying to grapple with this very, very local context that my colleagues have mentioned here. So, I'll give you another example, not academic, but actually sports. So here in Pennsylvania, the governor made a comment that he believed and strongly recommended all school sports should be paused at least until January. And immediately the Pennsylvania Interscholastic Athletic Association came out and said, wait a minute, we don't agree with that. They took a vote, which passed overwhelmingly, 20 something to 5, that said, no, we're fine with it. We're going to leave it up to the local districts to decide, right? And so as a local school board member now, it's put upon the school board and the superintendent to say what's right for our district. The governor says no, the association says yes. You have to figure out what makes the most sense for your population. And that brings in a whole nother set of stakeholders and people with really strong feelings and health and safety concerns. So, again, I don't have an answer to this balance right now, other than to point out the nuance of expertise and the different levels and people who are in positions, in governing positions and in sort of expert positions, bringing that humility and wanting to allow local decision making, but then the local decision makers really feeling like we need more expertise. We need more guidance that is stronger and that feels solid and doesn't feel like it's going to change in a week.
All right, let me nudge all of our viewers. If you have questions, please keep sending them in. I'm going to increasingly get them into the conversation. You can just use the chat function to do that. Any kind of question, comment, we'll get into the bloodstream. A question I want to ask before we do that, though, is going to be my last question, but it seems apropos at this moment, which is, like, what's on my mind right now is how do we develop the next generation of leaders who can learn from the lessons you guys are talking about? And if I reflect on the public policy graduate program I went through, we never talked about local practitioner wisdom. We never talked about the differences between civil society and experience and expertise. As a matter of fact, we were learning had 2 or 3 classes in economics, in statistics. We learned about regulations and state budgets. We were taught how to be technocrats. We weren't taught, now I'm thinking about how to be public leaders to make these kinds of decisions. So if any of you, do you have thoughts about, like, if you were in charge of a public policy program, helping develop the next generation of public sector leaders, especially for times of crisis, are there things that you would want them to read, activities to do, books that or articles that they should engage with that would really just set them up to do this kind of practical wisdom thing better than currently we're doing it?
Can I respond?
Yeah, please.
Okay, I think it depends on what sort of leader that we're talking about, right? I think anyone who has political power or authority, no matter at what level, whether we're talking about a local superintendent, or we're talking about a mayor, or we're talking about a governor, we're talking about someone who's more than an expert and who hopefully is more than just a technocrat, right? Because, and this is the thing that I sort of want to insist upon, look, just throwing more experts into the mix furthers the problem. It's not going to solve it, because there is a difference between expertise and political prudence. And I really think that if we're talking about, and this is like, There's like a fad in higher ed right now, and I'm not opposed to it, except like I feel like they're not making of it what they should. But there's a fad in higher ed that's like leadership, right? So you can get at my university, you can get a leadership degree, and there are like all these qualifications. And like it's fine. Okay, we want to be graduating leaders. I think that's good. But what is our model of leadership? And when we're talking about people who have political authority over a community, whether the community is big or small, we need someone who understands that their job is to bring about the flourishing of that community. And that this is not a question of mere expertise, right? And so there's no merely technocratic solution here, because you have to have someone who understands something about what real human goods are, and also how to deal with cases where we have competing goods, right? There is a hierarchy of goods. Health is a human good, but it is not the highest good. It is not even close. And I think part of what gets lost in the conversation in COVID is, you have people who are health experts, and that is their expertise, and that is important, and we should listen to them. But they are not experts about how to weigh health against the goods of family life, against the goods of religious worship, against the goods of education. There are other competing goods, and they are in no position to tell us, which is more important. And the biggest sort of extreme case of this was, free speech, free assembly versus COVID. And what we saw was this dramatic shift, right? That sometimes free speech mattered and sometimes it didn't. And there we have also the danger of a politicization of expertise, which we really have to guard against.
Tony, Jocelyn, thoughts about what future leaders need to be thinking about, how we foster their development?
Yeah, I would emphasize that given the outsized influence that science has on our contemporary culture, from whether it's political decision making, just popular culture, pervasive, and there is this sort of reverence that we have for scientific enterprise. There's also a kind of, I would say, increasingly common sort of populist backlash to scientific knowledge. So I think it's very important. This is in no way to take away from the importance of practical wisdom, but I think part of thinking about how to integrate any leader is going to have to, in a political context, is going to have to make decisions that are going to be in some way informed by scientific expertise. So I think it's important, I'm thinking about forming leaders, that they have some idea of how scientific expertise works, what it looks like. And I think one of the things that's striking is that, a distinction that might be helpful here is between, practicing scientist and, a bureaucrat, say, somebody that's employed, maybe has a scientific background, but is making decisions that are kind of political in nature. Maybe they work at a federal agency. That person has a different kind of expertise, maybe overlaps with the expertise of a practicing research scientist, but they're different. And one of the things that is noticeable to me when you talk to practicing scientists is that they tend not to be overly certain. They'll give you all of the nuances. They'll tell you, well, this actually only holds under these conditions, and we're still not sure about that. And up close, science is very messy. And part of the wonder of that enterprise is that it actually can generate reliable knowledge through a process that's actually quite messy and fragile and delicate. And so I think, and then you tend to find that the sort of certainty about scientific knowledge grows as you get farther from that core area of research experts who really actually know what they're talking about. And I don't say that as, it's not necessarily bad. I think that's just a kind of fact of the matter. Somebody that's in charge of a massive research program is going to have a different relationship, even though he or she is a scientist, to the core research being done in their project, right, than the actual people that are on the lab bench doing the work. So that's just a sort of fact about scientific knowledge that we need to keep in mind. And so I think what I'm saying is that we have to recalibrate our expectations as non-scientific experts about what scientific knowledge is and can do. And I think that's important for future leaders, for forming them, because if they're going to be in the political sphere, they're almost certainly going to be making decisions that are going to be influenced by scientific knowledge in some way.
Great. Jocelyn, any thoughts?
I would just quickly add, practical experience. So exposure to both in any kind of public policy program, deep understanding in how to navigate data, what's important to consider from scientific experts, and then practical, externship, internship, co-op, apprenticeship type models where public policy learners can really get in the arena and have to, if they can't do it live due to, the policymaking process, interviews and other qualitative approaches. But I think we're really doing a disservice to our future leaders if we are not, creating programs where they have deep exposure to real life decision making in this kind of way.
Yeah, just a quick story for me. I got out of my graduate program thinking I knew everything about regressions and how to make scientific decisions. And then the first state legislator and then first congressman I worked for, on day one, the people who were integrating me into the office had the same types of questions for me. Do you know why we're here? What is our number one job? And for them, the number one answer that I should have given was, we are here for the constituents. We answer their mail first. We answer their calls. We listen to them. We take them seriously. And those couple sentences were never articulated when you're thinking about public policy as just like a craft of expertise. How much can you know about a subject matter domain? I don't think we do a very good job of talking about that as we're developing people. So along those lines, a couple questions we're getting in right now from the audience relate to, like, in what kinds of instances should scientific knowledge, expertise be dispositive? Do we know when it should be dispositive, and in what kind of cases is it not? And so we should add other things. So an example is, smoking causes cancer. Is that the kind of thing that is dispositive? It ends discussion. We just go with the experts on that? Or are there moral, ethical, community, democratic considerations to add to that as well? But then also, how does that apply to things where there is less scientific certainty? Like, what should the right speed limit be? Or what should the tax rates for people who make $100,000 be? So is there a sliding scale or a way to think about when the science is pretty clear or when it's not?
I have thoughts on this. I don't want to dominate the conversation. I would say maybe two things about that. One is, I think something that is it should be part of our thinking when we're asking these questions is, what is at stake if the expert judgment is wrong? This is something that philosophers of science sometimes call inductive risk. So we all know that there's error in scientific knowledge, right? But what are the stakes of that error? Right. So if I am wrong about the steady state model of the universe, that might matter in terms of my getting at the truth. It might matter in terms of getting my funding, but it's not going to impact, Andy Smerrick.
That's right.
If I'm making a determination about, cancer risk or any of these other, a lot of the issues that we're actually talking about, public health interventions and so on, the stakes are a lot higher. And I think in those circumstances, experts themselves are making a different kind of judgment because they have to weigh extra epistemic, not strictly scientific considerations. It's part of what they're doing. I'll give you an example. If I, if let's say you're a doctor and you're trying to interpret the diagnostic test of a particular patient, you have to make a very specific determination about the outcome of that test and what it means. That requires a lot of knowledge, right? The prior probability that this person has the disease, weighing that against what we know about the test, complicated technical decision, but it also has an impact on that person. It also requires that you weigh something like the relative cost of a false positive and a false negative in your test. These are complicated decisions. Now, imagine you're making that decision, but the implications are not just for the patient, it's for the entire country. Yep. It gets a lot more complicated. So it becomes more technically complicated, but it also becomes more morally significant. And so that's one way that I would think about that. And just on the issue of kind of where the scientific knowledge is dispositive, I think it's just not always so simple, right? I mean, take the issue of masks. This issue is a very binary proposition, right? Do they work? Do they not work? Obviously, much depends on the nuance, right? And what sometimes you'll hear is staunch advocates of using masks will say, well, look, we know the evidence is clear, masks work. Well, it's actually not quite that simple, right? It's not like we did one massive randomized control trial and now we know masks work. What happened was we did get more evidence, more knowledge, but the expert recommendation changed because experts were weighing different kinds of factors, knowledge against new circumstance, trading risks against those kinds of risks. That complicated, Yes. Technical, yes. Does it go beyond narrow area of expertise? Yes. And that's what we need experts to give us their advice on. But that doesn't, fully resolve the question. Who gets to decide whether masks should be imposed? Is it a federal issue? Is it a state issue? What kinds of masks? How are we going to get them to people? There's a whole host of problems that follow on the tail of that. So again, I would just, say it's complicated.
Yeah, Jocelyn, as you've been dealing with these kinds of issues, have you found that there are any scientific findings that are dispositive that just make your job easy, or is judgment always necessary? Or you find that one person will say that evidence points in one way and it ends debate, but then someone else says, no, it's the other way around. And then how do you navigate that?
Certainly more of the latter in the current context. I think in education, we're always looking for the data. There are significant efforts, for many years to try to follow data and understand what it means and tells us. I think education data is highly political. There are a lot of different ways to spin the same study and the same statistics, depending on populations, context, things of that nature. So I think, to your question about how you navigate that, right? So you can have, again, in the current moment, things telling us that it should be safe to open, things telling us that it shouldn't be safe to open. And I think what we're trying to do at the most local level is really assess our community. And we do that through surveys and other imperfect measurements that really try to get as much authentic community input as possible. And again, I think really it's because of the trust factor. So in a situation like this, where you're talking about people's lives and you're talking about health and safety, that community trust piece is more important than ever. When you look at other types of education data for things like curriculum choices or, what interventions you might want to have for a certain subgroup of kids who year after year are not making improvements in math, that's a lot easier, right? I can trust data for my district that shows, different interventions that have helped those kids. When it comes to sending them back into schools in the middle of a pandemic, definitely not so clear.
Jen, is there a rule of thumb that you use on this? Like, when does practical wisdom get inched up in terms of power or inched down based on the science, the knowledge, the expertise? Like, how should a public leader think about this?
Well, I think that public leaders should listen to experts. I mean, I think that matters. I think it's complicated when the experts disagree, but let's just sort of set that complication aside. There's sort of yes, of course you follow data. Of course you listen to health experts when you're in the middle of a pandemic. And I think we've seen, some of the fruits of not doing that. And they are not good. But I also think at the end of the day, what worries me is when I see political leaders kind of abdicate their job and just hand it over to the experts as if the experts are political leaders when they're not. I think that ultimately, when we think about the specific kind of intelligence that we want our political leaders to have, it's not mere expertise. Now, any kind of good practical judgment will involve a true perception of the circumstance, and expertise is very important for that. But at the end of the day, a political leader has to balance competing goods and make the decision that they think is best for their specific community over which they have authority. And I think that they have to be able to pay attention to context and circumstances that is really outside of any expertise, right? They have to sort of see what's right in front of them. And so again, it really depends on what kind of leadership we're talking about. Are we talking about something very local? Are we talking about something federal? I think that there is something to be said for deferring to local communities to a certain extent, because each community has different circumstances. As what was going on in New York in March really had very little to do with what was going on in South Dakota. And so what was necessary in New York was arguably not necessary in South Dakota. And I just think that we need to learn to recognize those differences. At the same time, any expert or technocrat is still a human being engaged in a human activity. And it also matters that they be a good person, right? And so I don't want to totally be like, well, expertise, it just doesn't matter. It does. It actually matters, that our scientists also be good people. You can wreak a lot of havoc there. I mean, it's like important to keep them separate in the cases where we run them together and it's problematic. But at the end of the day, we want to recognize that these are all human beings, right? And so you're talking about an integrated human person.
And I do think, just quickly, like some of this leadership stuff, right? Some of when you are the governor or the superintendent, whoever it is at this level, you do have to have that experience of knocking on people's doors and facilitating difficult meetings and being in the arena in a way that lets you know your community. So you can balance, this is what I know about the scientific expertise, this is what I know, and this is what I know about my people. And right. that is not a science, that's an art as far as I'm concerned.
Well, that might be a great way. We only have about 5 minutes left. I want to give everyone a chance to say their final words on this. I mean, I could imagine someone who doesn't like the subject saying, Andy Smerek hosted a meeting where all they did was say, don't follow the science. So these are a bunch of people who are retrograde. They're trying to talk down science. When I think we're trying to do something different here. And what's on my mind is, like, how do we have a conversation about Dr. Fauci is great, but he was not infallible. He said some things early on about masks that he probably now regrets. Or there were some public health experts who got out ahead of themselves when it came to some of the public protest aspects of this. So is there some kind of way, that a rule of thumb that public leaders can use so they're not accused of being science deniers, but talking about this greater enterprise that science and scientific experts are part of, or pieces of the puzzle, but they aren't the entirety of it? So you can either pivot off of that or go in some other direction, but why don't each of you take a minute or two to say what else is on your mind? What should people take away from this?
Well, I'll have you to go first. I would say, I think it's important to keep in mind, there's a lot of discussion, especially in the kind of backlash against the COVID policies and so on, a lot of talk of the tyranny of experts and so on, and you kind of alluded to that, Andy. I think it's important to keep in mind that we do still have political leaders, right? So the way we are relying on expertise is a function of how our leaders and how we think about that expertise. And so I would emphasize the need for us to think carefully about what scientific expertise is and how it fits into our political decision making. It's not as though we just have, experts coming out of the laboratories, taking over the government. If they are making decisions they shouldn't make, then that's on the political leaders, right? So that's just the first thing I would say. And so what I would add is, I think it can be tempting to think about these complex questions as like, look, we have the political value decisions that need to be made here, and then we have the technical expert decisions that have to be made here. The reality is often it's much messier than that. If we're thinking about what kind of tests to use, we are making and how to get them to people. These are practical questions. They're also technical questions. They're also questions that require we make decisions, as I said before, about weighing the relative risks of false positives and false negatives. That's a value decision. We can make that decision. So it's complicated. And I think that having a more humane and sort of humble understanding of how scientific expertise works is helpful for thinking about how to integrate it into those multifaceted political decisions.
Professor Frey?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just in terms of closing remarks, I think that we really want to have models of good leadership, right? We need that. Like we can talk about it in an abstract way, but at the end of the day, in the practical life, what you need are models. And so, I'd also like a conversation about who are models of good leadership in this time. I think the president of my university, Bob Kaplan, has been an amazing leader. And I think part of that was his experience. He was a 3-star general. So this is a man who understands how to operate in a crisis and keep a lot of things going. But he also, I think certain character traits that he had have really made him an excellent leader in this time. He had a plan. He stuck to it. He reached out to the community here. He got the support of local government. He got the support of all the local hospitals and medical institutions. He was like, I want this plan to be a community plan. I want the community to feel good about this plan. And he stuck to the plan under incredible pressure. Because I think, frankly, he's got fortitude. And I said that from
A virtue.
it takes real fortitude. And that's what I'm saying. Like, you have to have it at the end of the day. You have to have the fortitude to face all of the criticism and just remain committed. Like, I truly believe, he did truly believe he was doing the right thing. I believe he was vindicated in the final analysis. But the pressure he was under was very extreme. And so I think that there are lots of examples of disasters, but there's also examples of good leadership. And I think we need to identify those and talk about why we think they were good and what we can learn from it.
That is a great to do for me. So maybe in a couple of months from now, in the new year, I should get together an event of a handful of people who are generally regarded as having managed this well, whether at the university level, or the state level, or something else, and learn how they navigated some of this stuff. Jocelyn, you get the final word.
Yeah, just really quickly, to me, the takeaway is just the balance. Is that I think what we've discussed here, I don't think there's a prevalent feeling among this panel or any other that expertise doesn't matter, or that it's so subjective. It does matter. I think data is the first thing we look for, certainly in my local area when we make decisions. But then there's also this very human element of governing and remembering that, and having some grace. It's not a popular thing to say, but like I said earlier, everyone's frustrated. Everyone, we're not flourishing, right? And so in these moments, what do we look to? What are those models of both the practical and the expert that can get us as close as we can day by day, and recognize that they shift and be willing to learn and pivot and make changes? But I think confident leadership is probably the biggest thing we need to focus on.
That's great. And we are perfectly right on closing time. So let me just end by thanking our three amazing guests, Jennifer Frey and Tony Mills and Jocelyn Pickford, for joining us, and for the MI team who helped put this whole thing together, and everyone who joined us online. I hope you find it as interesting as I did. We'll make this video available online, and the articles that we referenced. I hope everyone has a good weekend and stays healthy and safe. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.